I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Coming to you from my Rebel stronghold, licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. It's been an interesting week, folks, but not for the real estate reasons you would think. In my efforts to pump a little adrenaline into my ability to post shows, I had all these little ideas I was bouncing around in my head. One was a thought of the day, right, which I would do just a quick few-minute thing. Something I could record in the car or when I've got a couple of minutes between things. And I thought that way I could kind of still be putting stuff out there, things to maybe kick the gears in your head, turn in a different direction, because that's always good, right? Considering a different angle is always good. It just broadens the way you consider things. And I did 2 or 3 of them this week, and my technology failed me. Or it might have been pilot error, but I'm going to go with my technology failed me. Had issues, whether it was relating to the microphone I was trying to use or the software I was trying to use to put it into a format that would get it up posted. So it's been an interesting week fussing with that, of course, without enough time in those given chunks of time to actually troubleshoot the problem. So I'm going to try to do some of that this weekend, if I can manage to get time then. But just so you know, I am trying to put out the effort. I'm absolutely going to live up to my promise, as I am with this show today, delivering at least a show a week, and with possibly other little slightly different flavors of the show during the week is my goal, as I just kind of spelled out. Now, probably the best way to start off, since we're almost starting new here with the new year, I'd love for folks to be able to reach out to me. Share your ideas, suggestions, observations, whatever you might have relating to real estate. The best way to do that is going to be to visit me at my website, RebelBroker.com. From there, you can click the contact button, send along any ideas, suggestions, or observations you've got. I'd love to hear them. I always love getting feedback, real-world feedback, right? Now, the information I share with you that's anecdotal or experiential for me comes from my marketplace. Now, I read an awful lot of data that relates to the nation at large and in certain markets across the country, but I don't live in those other markets. I live in the market here. So I'm trying to share insights from my market that I think you can translate to any market, right? Lessons that you learn that can be universally applied. And I think I get a better feel for some of those things when I get stories from all of you. So I would encourage you to share those with me. I'd love to hear about your recent, what escrow weirdness did you just experience in Georgia? What kinds of properties are you finding in Tennessee that you think are super sexy? What just happened to you in Phoenix relating to a home search or an investment property search or multifamily property search or apartment complex search that was interesting, that really you thought demonstrated something not a lot of people know about that market? I'd love to hear those kinds of things. So head to the website, therebelbroker.com, to share those with me. I'd love to hear them. Now, while you're there, why not click the big red button at the top of the page? 2 good reasons to do it. 1, you're going to help me grow the show. 2, you're going to put yourself in a drawing for a $50 Amazon gift card, which we are going to draw for in the first week of February. Now, this is something we did for a while. God, I don't know. We may have done it for 2 years, and then it sort of went by the wayside for a while. But I thought I'd bring it back because it was kind of fun, and it was always nice to interact with folks. And oftentimes, in addition to clicking that red button and providing the taking a survey just to help the show, folks would also reach out via email, and that was another great way to encourage folks to communicate with me and hopefully share some of that knowledge with the show. Okay, so here we are. It is Friday morning. I am almost fully caffeinated. I have my mocha here next to me, and I'm ready to go. Today, I want to talk about an article that came out from Realtor Magazine titled "The 7 Signs of a Market Cool Down." And I thought this would be good data to have in your head no matter what you're doing in real estate, because these are principles, and some of these are okay. It amazes me that for a magazine that's titled Realtor.com, it so frequently comes out with stuff. You'll notice, if you're a longtime listener to the show, that Realtor.com or Realtor Magazine does not figure prominently in the articles that I share. We do from time to time. So you have to always remember where your bread is buttered, right? And in the case of Realtor Magazine and being with Realtor Association stuff, it's really more about boosting the number of folks out there that get a real estate license, right? And join the Association of Realtors, because that's how they make money, in addition to all the other services that they sell to real estate folks. So I always kind of have a grain of salt. I've never been a huge follower of Lawrence Yun, who is the economist for for realtors. And we've actually had shows where we've talked about what he's saying is happening versus what the data shows. And every once in a while he's right on the mark, but it usually tends to be those instances where what he's saying would encourage more folks to get their real estate license. So anyway, just my opinion. If you're out there listening, I would love to actually have a conversation with you every once in a while on some of these subjects. But I frequently disagree with Mr. Yun, respectfully. Okay, so let's jump in and see if we can't tease out some data. Now, if you're listening to the show and you're thinking, well, I'm just a guy who has a casual interest in real estate, and I'm looking to maybe buy my house this year or buy a house for myself in the next couple of years, this is still good data for you. Why? Because whether or not a market is cool or hot defines your position in that market. And that's true for an investor, a seller, a buyer. It doesn't matter. This is data that I think is critical for anyone. And it's also a conversation that you should have with your real estate professional when you find one you want to work with. And another thing, I've actually had a couple of folks reach out to me since the last show, and one of them was asking me about a discount brokerage firm that's floating around out there and saying, well, wow, isn't this the end of the typical model for real estate brokerage? And I'd say no, it's the same. It's a digital version of the same thing that's been going on for 20 years in real estate in terms of discount brokerages. They've been around forever. What's the other one that I used to always bump into? Where everything was a la carte, right? If you wanted it in the MLS, it was a certain percentage. If you wanted everything had it was sort of every single item had a line item to it. And we're going to probably do a show on that one. I might even do it next week. But in fact, the new version of it has an even bigger downside. And it actually is a perfect embodiment of two things that I've always told you should never tolerate from your agent in real estate. And in fact, using those brokerages would represent you spending $1 to save a penny. So we'll cover that one relating to discount brokerages, and I'll name names. I mean, I'll name the company that we're talking about specifically because they've made a lot of headlines lately. But when you get in there and start reading the nitty gritty, you realize, well, hey, that's something I'd never tolerate from my broker, and that's something I shouldn't tolerate from my broker. So, and both of those things are the two huge reasons that you lose money, that you don't get the money you deserve for the property you're trying to sell, or really reduces your probabilities of getting the amount of money you need. So that's for a future show. A little tease there. But let's get into what this article claims are the 7 signs of a market cool down. And what's really important is to not just take these, because remember, we've talked about this data before. You shouldn't just be looking at, well, how many days on market, because that's not by itself a solid indicator. You shouldn't take necessarily the ratio between list and sold price. You really want to look at the overall market in terms of all the elements, the days on market, list price, sales price comparison, all that wonderful stuff to get a better picture. So don't let one of these be a thing, but here's the great thing. Once you understand these elements, you could go to your real estate professional that you've chosen and ask them to send you data regularly. Now, one smart thing to do if you don't want to interact with a realtor, a smart thing to do up front would be to go to Zillow or Trulia, set up a search that you would call your bread and butter property that you're interested in, and keep abreast of homes that come on the market, how fast they'll go off the market. And plus on Trulia, you can go to the market page for your area and get an idea there. Now, if you're really focusing, you're really probably going to want to establish a relationship with your real estate person, because they can actually create a map that will be a border that you establish, right? So you can say, you know what? this is the submarket I'm interested in. And maybe it's only a 5 block by 10 block area, or maybe it's 5 by whatever dimensions you want, whatever streets border it. You can set that up as a search, and you can have them send you all the historical data in terms of what's happened in that market. And then from there on, you can simply have that data get sent to you, and you could have your own spreadsheet. You could have a database you're running yourself, whatever, and keep track of what's going on with that marketplace. So who do I suggest does that? Everybody. Whether you've been doing this for 20 years, you're probably already doing it in one form or another so that you've got market awareness. Or maybe you've completely delegated finding properties to a really effective real estate agent who's sort of become your partner in crime in finding good deals. Or if you're someone who's just a dabbler, let's say you still haven't overcome that fear you have of jumping in and buying that first property. This is absolutely the first step towards doing that. Maybe the second step, maybe the first step is simply following things on Trulia or some other public site. But if you want to really drill in, and you have, through your experience on Trulia and Zillow and what you've been following, identified the geographic area you want to focus on, the next step would be establishing this relationship and getting that report sent to you. It can happen on a daily basis if you want to be looking at that area like a buyer would, right, where you get updates on price reductions or new listings or sold homes, all that kind of stuff. And that way, you're compiling your own data, and you are right there in the thick of it, and you know what's going on in that market. So when a really good deal comes along, you know it's a really good deal. If a crazy not good deal comes along, you know that too, because you've been keeping up with all this stuff. Okay. So let's go ahead and hit the list. Again, 7 signs of a market cool down as shared by Realtor Magazine. Number 1 on their list is increased days on market. I don't disagree with this one. I think we talked about it when we did the data show last week. According to them, the buying market is becoming less competitive as demand increases and homes sit on the market a little longer. Help your sellers price their properties correctly by using the MLS to track down days on market correlates with price points in your area. Now, you're going to want to also be aware of the different elements going on in your marketplace. And when it comes to increased days on market, you really need to pay attention to the market size because when it comes to the translation of increased days on the market to your local area can be brutal. Let me give you an example. Let's say I take the average days on market for all of Santa Clara County. And right now, I think this time of year, which is a normal for the cycle, it's up around 30 days. Well, there are going to be some areas where it's twice that and some areas where it's half that. Because we're dealing with San Jose. It's a gigantic area, right? If you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you don't want to get the increased days on market or the days on market number and see that it has increased over the year on a month-to-month basis. Not month-to-month meaning last month, this month, but the same month last year. And remember, when you're comparing this data, you want to look at the history. And if you were to pull up the data for Tulsa, you'd see probably the same graph you see when you do my area is you see a cyclical thing. You see the days on market go up as you head into the winter months, as you go into October, November, December, and then January. And then in my area, once you've gone through January, that number starts to drop again and go really low. Over the last year, it peaked at about 30 days and dropped down to about 12 days. 2018, in the last 5 years in my area, was the lowest days on market at the peak of the market when things were really selling. Okay, so that's something you're going to want to keep an eye on and translate it into your local experience. In other words, don't take the data for all of Tulsa for that one neighborhood in Tulsa that you're interested in. You've got to get the data to back up what you're considering for that marketplace. Now, next on the list that they share with us is price cuts. That's an interesting one to track. It's one that you can get updates on Trulia will actually just show you when you visit the property. So you don't need to be plugged in per se in terms of getting the data via email or having it sent to you. You can simply go and see that it's been dropped. It's even easier to see that when you're using a search engine that's provided to you by a real estate agent. Now, again, not all real estate agent provided search engines and interfaces for finding properties are equal. Mine is very different, for instance, from the folks who are further north in Sacramento. I've seen theirs and it's funky, very different from mine. I'm not even sure I could give someone the exact same data I can provide via mine. So remember, each association has control over how their MLS system is maintained, and they may use completely different software for that. So keep that in mind. But typically they have a core set of features that are going to let you do these kinds of things. And I'm just not experienced enough, for instance, with the Sacramento one to generate all the data that you'd want to see. But it should be out there for you to get. Now, so price cuts, yes, absolutely. But again, and to go into one other thing that also applies to the days on market number is find out where that is true for different price bands. Let me give you an example. We'll relate it to the days on market. If you go for higher end properties, if you look at in my area, luxury prices start to begin at around $1.3, $1.4 million. And above that, absolutely increased days on market, reduced prices. However, not true in the $600,000 to $800,000 range. Not true at all. Days on market is actually down. No price cuts are happening there. And the vast majority of price cuts I'm seeing right now are all at the high end. I get emails that tell me when a price cut happens on a property, and I have yet to see a price cut come in that I'm alerted to that wasn't a property that was above 1.3 million. And I can't even remember the last time. So you're not seeing drops in prices. Now, there was a little spate of that in some areas in San Jose where people were really overpricing less desirable properties because they thought the market was just carrying that. And as someone who would exercise what I suggested earlier and is subscribing to the data for their market, you'd know this, right? And I'm specifically referring to smaller 2-bedroom properties that suddenly the sellers there had this opinion that, well, if all these other properties that are 3 bedrooms have gone up X percent, well, then apparently my property should be up X percent as well. As we've talked about previously on this show, 2-bedroom props tend to not escalate in price at the same rate as 3 bedrooms simply because they have lower desirability, which equals fewer buyers in the market to buy them. And as that tightens, you end up with situations where those homes can stay on the market for a while because there's just not that big of a pool. Most folks are interested in at least that 3-bedroom. I rarely get folks who want to start off a search for a 2-bedroom place. All right, so price cuts. This is also another one that's going to be interesting to note related to price and location. So keep that in mind. It's absolutely a sign of a slowing market when folks are dropping their price, but people will often mistake that. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you suddenly see tons of properties having their list price lowered. Does that indicate to you that prices have gone down? Not necessarily. What it could mean is that all of these sellers, and this is happening more and more recently because we're seeing more folks putting their properties on market. Now, my anecdotal experience is absolutely, I'm getting a lot of people contacting me about potentially putting their homes on the market. I'm seeing a greater interest in listing homes this year at this time than I did at the same time last year. So, what does that equal for you as a potential buyer or investor? Well, if you're a seller and you're doing this, you're looking at these numbers, you're seeing Zillow constantly telling you how much more your home is worth. So the problem is that a lot of these folks have assumed a level of growth in prices that isn't currently sustainable. We've already talked about how, at least in my area, we've seen what you could easily call a flattening in many markets up in the Silicon Valley area. And we have actually seen a bit of a drop in some parts of the Morgan Hill area that I serve. Okay, well, that being the case, what you're finding is less a price drop and more a price that's been adjusted to the appropriate level of increase, right? So folks were assuming, well, this should be worth X percent, let's say, right? Last year we got 8% increase, another 8% this year. They're just over applying a percentage that represents the old market. So the adjustment you're seeing is not a price reduction in terms of folks now are lowering the price related to the market. I don't know. I realize this sounds a little goofy. At least it sounds goofy coming out of my mouth. But the point here is that what they let's say the home, they were hoping for a 10% growth in this thing, so they based it on that. And what they really should have assumed was a 5% or a 6%. So I think a lot of that is simply a readjustment to overinflated expectations from sellers who rarely get encouragement from real estate people to hit a lower price. Real estate people, sadly, more often than not, will encourage that higher price and simply say, well, it's always easy to drop the price at some point. And I just think that we're seeing that. So it's not like we're seeing these drops for the reasons that I think this implies. I think it's simply because the market has flattened a little bit and in some areas actually declined a little bit. It's just more folks who are incorrectly pricing right out of the gate, right? So I guess that still kind of applies. Maybe it's a distinction that only makes a difference to me, but I think it's an issue that kind of feeds the way I evaluate properties when I'm looking at them. I saw a listing that came on the market yesterday, and immediately in my head was that is a poorly priced listing. That is at least $40,000 over what the current market will sustain, and I can see why they're doing it. They're getting artificially inflated numbers from Zillow. A lot of the automated tools, which realtors find popular because they're automated, they could just plug in an address and it poops out a number, so less work for them, are doing the same thing, but they aren't really taking into effect local market conditions and how things really are. And before, things were growing fast enough or the market was crazy enough that those kinds of mistakes were fixed by time, right? The market was going so fast in terms of growth that the market would catch up with that price before a seller would be willing to drop the price, right? So still an indicator of a softening market, but there is a distinction there. Okay, next we're hit number 3. We're going to hit number 3 and then take a quick break and cover the rest of these. But number 3 is what they call a lower absorption rate. When supply is exceeding demand, it's a good time for you and your buyers to start looking for price reductions. To quickly calculate the absorption rate in your area, divide the number of homes sold in a given month by the total number of homes available during that month. Now, we talked about this number last week. We looked at it from 2 standpoints: the total number of homes, and then also the number of homes listed. So in terms of you compare the number of homes that sold and the number of homes that listed, and that kind of gives you an interesting idea of the balance between entry into the market and exit from the market. But then it also gives you, this number will also simply give you the months. You can calculate the months of inventory that you have, right? Based on total inventory and sales divided into that. That'll give you sales per month will give you how many months of inventory. And the more months of inventory you have, the more buyers tend to be in the driver's seat. So just a dramatic increase in the supply of the properties. All right, we're going to take a quick break, but don't go away. When we come back, we're going to cover the remaining bullet points here that'll hopefully give you a better perspective on how to evaluate your marketplace. So don't go away. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right. Aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. We are trying to wrap our head around the ways to get a handle on whether or not our market is cooling. Now, of course, the best time to figure this out is as it's happening, or if possible, before it's fully obvious. And that's one reason why I talk about some of the subtleties in each one of these. I know on the price cuts, and I know the absorption rates on some of these things, there were some subtle differences there. But the subtleties help you find them faster. So if you find these things easier, it gives you a better understanding of whether or not now is the time or is the best time coming, that type of thing. So that's kind of why I try to get a little bit into the weird corner case evaluations of some of these stats. Next on their list is decreased home value growth. This is a statistic you should be constantly watching on behalf of your clients. If you're a real estate person or if you are an investor or a buyer or anybody else, this is something you should be tracking. Tracking average price changes is one way you can quickly spot overall trends in your market for your buyers and sellers. In many areas, home values are beginning to slow. Now, this is absolutely true, and it's another reason why I like to do price banding evaluations. And a lot of folks don't do it, but when I look at monthly data, I love looking at the tables that show me activity within different price ranges. It's really interesting, and it's really bizarre how you can see not a regular linear increase, right? And what do I mean by that? Just a straight up, right? Or straight down, a peak and then a down. What you end up seeing, though, is a certain level of activity at the lower end, which tends to be a pretty big peak. And then you see activity drop in this weird area, in my area particularly, between about $900,000 and $1.2 to $1.3 million. And then suddenly you see that jump back up again. If you remember back to the last show where we talked about the top 4 price bands, it wasn't bands that were right next to each other. It tended to be a chunk of bands that were at this midpoint and a chunk of bands that were way up at the luxury point. And so when you realize that that is non-linear, the other thing that should tick in your head is that anything non-linear, right? Because people grok linear. Linear meaning if you start all the way to the left, the trend tends to just continuously go up, 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 right? People easily grok that. That's something that people understand. And that doesn't take any real research to get. But when systems like this don't conform to that, the nooks and crannies of where those changes occur, where there is non-linear performance or non-intuitive performance of these different properties, those indicate areas of opportunity for you as a buyer or an investor. You can typically find, because there's less competition there, right? And you need to look at the data. Is it simply because there were less homes in that price range? Now, that can absolutely be a problem if you're looking at a small town, particularly like Morgan Hill, right? But that trend was apparent for all of Santa Clara County. And when you looked at the total number of properties that were even available, the distribution of homes in those price points did not explain those variations in activity at the different price points. So that's where I'm getting at. I may have just lost some of you, but what I'm basically saying is the reason why we see those variations isn't because we see lower numbers of homes in a price point that shows lower activity. We see plenty of activity there. We see plenty of homes in those. We just don't see the activity level that we see at other price points. That equals fewer buyers in competition with you for those properties. So identify those price points for 2 reasons. If you're a buyer, opportunity. If you're a seller, don't price in those price ranges, right? Remember we talked about this before where if you are paying close attention to this is something I do when I'm listing a home. Let's say there's a bizarre price wall at $1.1 million. Now this is me taking an example from real world history where anything that was priced at 1.1 million or higher, suddenly dramatic increase of days on markets and a dramatic increase in the probability that you're going to take more off of your list price when it finally sold. Now, the way searches work is buyers put in a price, and that's the way it works, right? So they're just not even going to see your home if you're priced above that. But that also means fewer eyes on your property. And what statistically I have found is, let's pretend there's that wall at $1.1 million. If you listed your home at $1,090,000 versus 1.1, you had a much higher probability of selling faster and for more. In other words, over your asking price, whereas if you had priced that exact same property at 1.1, it was more likely you sold for $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 below that price, and it took you longer to get it sold. There are absolutely examples of that. Now, of course, no two homes are exactly alike. In the cases I was comparing back when this was an interesting dynamic for me, it was actually other properties that I was not the one who listed. So there's that element, right? I definitely market my properties very differently than the typical real estate agent does. In fact, the vast majority simply put it in the MLS and let it get shared with the other sites, and then they're done. I tend to do quite a bit beyond that. So who knows what element that played in it, but that's numbers I've seen. And in fact, I think I shared this example before. This was back when things were really nuts, and we had when this would have been 2012, 2013, where I had a home that, in terms of square footage, bedrooms and baths, amenities, all that stuff, very much on par with another property not too far away, which had been on the market for over 100 days and had all these price drops. I listed a home for more than what that home was listed for. I sold it in less than 30 days. I sold it for over asking price. And I actually got a call from the listing agent on that property asking me how I did it. So it was one of those things where, depending on how you price, what band you're in, and remember, this banding works not just by lowering your price, but sometimes increasing your price into a more active band where more buying is happening. Now, granted, if you're going up, you're a property that was already showing up for those searchers anyway in terms of that. So I have a hard time explaining that one. But it's also like the company that comes out with a product. This is a story I got from a gentleman who had worked for a company that made switches, like network switches, right? Some of you have a hub, right? You have a USB hub connected to your computer to connect multiple USB devices to it, or in your house, maybe you have a Ethernet hub. Well, there's another thing that's like a hub called a switch that just logically differently handles the connections in it. That's what they made. And it was awesome. And it supported all of these various encryption level things and did a lot of wonderful things. But it was 1/3 the cost of a lot of its competitors, and they couldn't sell them to save their lives. So for a while, they were dropping the price, still not selling. Then they raised the price to 90% of their nearest competitor, and suddenly they were selling like hotcakes. In my head, I think that dynamic can also play into homes. Not frequently, but in some cases it can. So that's the only way I can really explain this, where you see this price banding, and then by raising your price and you never want to do this where you change the price once you go on the market. Raising the price after you go on the market doesn't do it, because those people that see you came in lower and then see that the price was increased, they're going to want an explanation for that. And simply saying, well, I saw more activity at this price band, that's not going to do it. So typically this is a strategy that you need to implement from the very beginning, right? When you go into the marketplace. However, going the other direction, reducing the price into a certain price point, does still tend to work with this strategy, but it does still not solve the stale listing problem. I'm still a firm believer in, you need to hit the ground with your strongest proposition. So if you think that this holds any validity for you in terms of price banding in your marketplace and activity levels at different bands, you really should come out of the gate with this strategy in place and not implement it later. I just don't think that it gets as much bang for the buck unless you do it that way. Okay, next on our list, higher inventory levels. And of course, we've talked about this one. And again, one reason why I like to look at this is simply because if you take the data, if you take the number of homes listed versus number of homes sold, or just the inventory numbers of what's sold, you can sort of look at it as also the number of buyers you're in competition with. So for each home, how many buyers were there? How many because assume that each home that sold had a buyer. So call that the buyer column instead of the sold home column. And then all the properties that are trying to get sold, think of that. Those are sellers of a home on the homes that sold side, or the homes that are listed side. And then use that ratio to figure out, well, how many buyers per home are there now for all the homes currently in the marketplace? And of course, you want to be smart about this too. If you're a seller, you want to look at that number as it relates to homes similar to yours. Right? You don't want to, if you're a single family residential home, you don't want to be comparing it to the condos and the townhomes or the 2 bedrooms if you're a 3-bedroom, right? Because that'll skew it. But it can absolutely give you a gauge into the interest level at your feature set in terms of what your home has to offer. So that's obviously the seller side of it. The buyer side of it is absolutely. And again, submarkets are the thing. If the inventory in a certain area is crazy, like there's an area here in Morgan Hill where we've suddenly seen an uptick in the number of homes that are listed. So folks looking even, and I don't know anybody who is just looking in a specific neighborhood in Morgan Hill, for instance. Most folks that are searching either all of Morgan Hill or they're searching all of South San Jose, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy for a property. So I get very few people who come in and say, I want to live in that neighborhood. Does it happen? Absolutely. There are some standout neighborhoods. You should know those in your marketplace if you're educating yourself well on your marketplace. I happen to live in one of those markets where people would say, I want to live there. I live in a place called Holiday Lake Estates. It's awesome. I'm right off of a lake. I have an amazing view from my window right now that I'm checking out. I can see the lake. It's awesome, right? And you get that sort of mountain living, but still only being 10 or 15 minutes away from the freeway and the grocery store. Understand those things about your marketplace too, and then you're also going to be better able to evaluate what's going on in that market. Now, right now, inventory in my marketplace, almost nothing. I think there's one home currently actively listed for sale in Holiday Lake Estates. As a seller, what should I think about this number? If you are seeing a ton of homes listed in your marketplace, you want to really understand where your home sits in that hierarchy. And you also want to have a really clear understanding of what homes have sold and what they sold for and whether or not they sold for list price over the last 6 months. Last 3 months is even better, but if there's no data for the last 3 months, push it back 6. Push it back as far as you need to get any data at all. But if you live in a community that has its own kind of unique offering, you'd want to try to keep that encapsulated in terms of taking data just from that community to make your decision. If it's totally overcrowded with listings, wait for a sweet spot. If you're seeing the market's actually doing pretty well and things are selling within a few days, that's great. Then maybe the competition doesn't matter. But if you're seeing tons of properties on the market that are staying on for longer periods of time than, say, is normal for the larger area. Let's say, for instance, I would compare Holiday Lake Estates days on market to days on market for Morgan Hill and see what's the difference. Are they selling faster in Holiday Lake Estates compared to Morgan Hill in general or not? Get a feel for what is happening with the inventory in the market you're interested in. And you're going to, again, make better decisions as a seller. As a buyer, if you're seeing tons of homes listed in a certain community, first, you want to find out why. It could simply be that's what's happening, right? It's a lot of folks have decided they're at the top of the market. They want to pull their money out while they can, and that could be it. But if you're also seeing that accompanied with increasing days on market and prices being dropped, that could spell a really great opportunity for you as a buyer. Next, new construction. And right now, in my opinion, new construction is not a good thing for you as a buyer. It's overpriced. It tends to be stuff that was aimed at luxury sales anyway, at least in my area. And I'm sure this isn't true across the country, but I know here in my local area, ridiculously overpriced for a lot of these things. In fact, we did this comparison earlier last year where we talked about the premium you tend to pay for a new home. And I believe we came down on, it used to be 8%. Before all the new regulations and stuff got kicked in over the course of time from about the year 2000 to the year 2008, regulations, fees, and what you could call extortion amounts that are being paid by builders really increased the cost of building a home, so forced these folks to try to cater to markets that would give them a bigger return on investment, which tended to be luxury. So what you ended up with was the premium you're paying on a new home tended to be not 8% or 6%. I can't remember. It was either 8 or 6, but tended to be more like 20%. So that's nuts. And that's totally makes no sense. But there is light on the horizon. I am seeing a large number of new construction properties that are getting price reductions, which is kind of encouraging. I actually got an email today. God, do I still have it? Yeah, I do. So this is actually something that came across my desk from PR Newswire. Headline: Price cuts on new construction homes becoming more common. Nearly all of the nation's largest housing markets saw the share of new construction homes with price cuts increase between the beginning and end of 2018. Some of their bullet points here are about a quarter of all new construction homes saw a price cut in the fourth quarter of 2018, with a typical drop throughout the quarter being 2.6%. The median list price after a price reduction was $389,900 at the end of the year. The biggest price reductions, check this out, the biggest price reductions at the end of the year were in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where new construction homes are among the most expensive in the country. Totally illustrates the stuff we've been talking about on this show now for over a year and a half, where the new construction at the high end is the thing. Total softening at the luxury end. But, so what does that spell? I made this point before, and a lot of you disagreed with me because it's happened, right? It happened in 2008. Luxury homes become mainstream homes, right? Never more true than now. Now, my contention has always been that these prices were so overpriced to begin with that folks would have to stay in them for an awful long time for them to then be able to be resellable at a price point that would be good for them, right? They'd need to wait for the market to catch up with how much their home was paid, how much they paid for the home. And now what we're going to see is, I think, over the course of a downturn, right? And I think we're not quite to the point where we see a 2007-8 thing, but these new construction homes, when we do finally see a downturn, they're going to have no choice but to drop the prices on these things. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing homes that in my market. Now, remember, the market I talk about is crazy numbers. When I throw these numbers out, you are going to want to choke. Particularly, I've been watching, a lot of people know that I've been jazzed about Chattanooga, Tennessee for a while, and I'm still hot to go out there. I just saw a 4-bedroom, 3-bath home, only like 6 years old, come on the market for $260,000 or something, right? So I get that there's a number out there in the real world that just makes our numbers look crazy, right? But so these homes that are at the luxury market level that are 1.3, 1.4 million bucks, I could easily see a time in the not too far distant future where that home sells for 1.1, right? Now remember, when downturns came before, luxury homes always, as a percentage of overall quote unquote value, suffered the most in those marketplaces. For those of you who've been listening for a really long time, even back when I was doing this and during when this was happening, right? I started in January of 2007 doing this show. So when we were talking in 2008, 2009, 2010, when things were just brutal for a lot of these homeowners, there were homes that had sold for $2.5 million that suddenly were selling for $900,000. And that's a big chunk of cash. So there was all the stuff at that end is going to become far more affordable, assuming these things don't get worked out before a downturn. And there's so many out there that are super high priced. It wouldn't surprise me if they don't. Now, here's the other thing. Builders may have learned their lesson. We had a giant building push here in Morgan Hill during the last downturn, right off of a little road called Butterfield, close to, I think, what's the name? Tenant, close to Tenant in Butterfield. And the company I was working for at the time, at that point, I was hanging my license with another brokerage. That's a whole other story. And they had the exclusive rights to list and sell all this new construction, and none of it was selling. An entire street of for sale signs from the same company. It was like a bad joke. And prices just kept getting reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced. And then when things started to turn around a little bit later, phase 2 and phase 3 of that, right, more recently got built. And a lot of those homes finally got built at a time and bought at a time when the market actually helped those folks out and had them make sense. But I tell you, all those homes that got built prior to the official downturn that then had to try to sell after, the amount of drop in price was crazy. That some people got amazing deals on those properties. Okay, so if you do want to check this out and get more info on this price cuts in new construction, you can head to PR Newswire. Again, price cuts on new construction homes becoming more common is the headline. To give you some of the actual data, across the country, 25.1% of new construction homes had a price cut in the fourth quarter. So 25%, a quarter of the new construction saw a drop in price, compared with 19.2% of new homes in the first quarter of the year. This mirrors a trend seen in the overall housing market, with price cuts becoming more common. Let's see. Buyers were most likely, and this is some of the markets where this happened is amazing. So we already discussed how San Francisco and Los Angeles were big. Buyers were most likely to find a price reduction in Denver, where 40.3% of new construction homes had a price cut in the fourth quarter of the year. New homes in San Francisco and Los Angeles saw the biggest price reductions in the fourth quarter at 8.5%. However, these markets are also two of the most expensive for new construction. The typical new home with a price cut in Los Angeles cost $2 million even after its price is dropped. So that gives you some context on where we're talking about here. $2 million is still freaking crazy. All right, next on our list is slowed investor activity. Well, of course, we've talked about this before, and it's always I have always found it amazing. Well, not amazing, maybe an opportunity to learn when I talk to investors who are like, hey, I want to buy in Silicon Valley and invest and all this other kind of stuff. Well, okay, if you want the lowest return on investment possible, go for it. In fact, data we've covered on this show over the last 2, 3, 4 years has shown Silicon Valley, San Francisco, San Jose, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, all the hot spots for investment at the very bottom of return on investment. Now, other folks will argue, well, yeah, but then you get the market boost, right? Well, and I'm always hesitant to rely entirely on market momentum for my value. So there's 2 ways you get value out of a home for those folks who aren't aware of it, right? It's just because you haven't thought about it. One is the value of the property itself increases over time. That's one way you get value. Now, why does that give you value? Because that equity, as you accumulate it, is leverageable. You can get a bank. If you suddenly find that your property has increased in value by $100,000, you're going to find that a bank is going to be willing to lend you half that or more, maybe even 80%, depending on what you're doing and what your credit rating is. So if it goes up 100%, you could potentially walk away with 80 grand to do something else with, right? So that's cash you can get access to. It's also cash that you put in your pocket if you sell the property. Lots and lots of people used that strategy as the market just went up and up and up, right? They'd buy it, they'd hold it for a year, and they'd make 10, 15%, depending on where the property was, and possibly even adding more to that by making improvements to the property. But to be honest, there was an awful lot of lazy folks who simply bought, held, rented it for a year, and then sold it a year later or 2 years, right? Then there's the other end of the equation where the property provides value because of what you sell of it each month, meaning rent, right? You don't actually care. If your strategy is a long time hold kind of a deal, you don't really care what the market value of the home is. It's great in terms of you maybe being able to take stuff out cash wise for other investments, but in terms of cash flow, if you're a monthly cash flow person, that's your focus. I tend to be a little bit more that guy. So my bias is probably going to tell you it's better to buy, hold, and rent. I say always do a yearly evaluation to see if it makes sense to sell, but I'm always leaning more towards that. And right now, a lot of what's going on with the rental market supports it for me because I don't see rents going down. In fact, there was another story I read about apartment rents are expected to go up faster than the rate of inflation over the next year. And I love that. That is fantastic because everybody hates apartments anyway. So if apartments continue to go up in rental rates, that means all us single-family residential folks or townhome owners who rent a townhome are suddenly going to see a lot more interested existing apartment dwellers thinking, well, crap, there's only a $50 difference or a $100 difference between where I am, which is in a freaking cramped box, surrounded by other people in a cramped box. Why not get a house where I'm going to have a yard and an actual garage and I'm not seeing other people parked in my numbered spot in the garage or fighting for a parking space wherever they are in my apartment complex? It's a huge deal for us in terms of folks that offer that kind of living. Hell, it's even good for folks who have condos as long as you're offering amenities that differentiate it from apartment living, right? And we chatted about that earlier last year in terms of leveraging off of that kind of thing. So we were supposed to be talking about slowed investor activity. Sorry, I got distracted by the bright, shiny thing. Well, yes, of course it is. That simply tends to mean that more and more investors see less opportunities to pull profit from the pool, right? And another way to temper this is understand the kind of investing that was going on that has now slowed, right? If it is the momentum, the velocity investor, meaning I buy it, I hold on to it for a while, and then I pull money out because the market has carried it, that kind of investor absolutely isn't there anymore in a lot of these markets. I'm not a fan of those kinds of investors. Does it work? Sure, it does to a kind of a degree, I guess, but I don't see that as being the big bang in terms of what you can do with real estate and what you can achieve. Flippers would be the next category up, right? Where they buy a home, they recognize all the things that make it an unattractive property, and they fix it, right? Maybe it's an outdated floor plan. Maybe it's just stinky. Maybe it smells like cigarette smoke. Carpet's horrible, right? There's different types of obsolescence in the real estate world. We've got, like I think 5 different categories of obsolescence that you can rate a property by. But You don't need to know the vocabulary words to recognize it yourself. People like more open feelings, so walls between kitchens and living rooms tend to go down. All that stuff. And if anybody who's watched an HGTV show knows what I'm talking about. So those are folks who come in, change things up, make it a beautiful property, and then sell it. They've added value through improving the property. And then the next kind of investor would be someone who buys and holds for rental purposes, and that's a totally different equation. Any property can be positive cash flow. It just depends how much money you're willing to put into the deal to buy it. Right now, I would much rather be able to sit down and buy a property where I only need to put 20% down or 30% down or even less and get positive cash flow. Here in Silicon Valley, odds are you're going to have to put down an awful lot of money before it's positive cash flow. And of course, the more money you put down, the less your return on investment. If I have $500,000 tied up in a home where I'm only making $4,000 a month in rent, do the math. What is that a good expenditure of your cash? And that's not even a realistic number for today, actually. You'd need to have more than that. The amount, because it's really more about the amount loaned out in terms of whether or not you're positive cash flow. But the bottom line is you have much too much money tied up in that to make it worth it. And so this is, again, another topic we've covered. But the reality is you have to have a ton of money into that property because the rents have not gone up nearly at the rate that home prices have. So under that circumstance, it becomes very difficult to become positive cash flow. I have had investors who were hell-bent on buying an investment property in Silicon Valley and did it. And some of them were super smart. I've got my dentist is one of my investor clients, and she bought a property at the exact right time in the exact right community that was destined to bounce back and was super desirable. So she bought it, and I don't think she put more than 20% down, but she is now easily positive cash flow, and she has been pretty much throughout the life of the property. There are other places where I have had investors buy acknowledging they are not positive cash flow and just assuming at some point they will be, and they're willing to accept that loss every month. For me, that's just not worth it. Now, what's the alternative? Well, first of all, I would rather not have $500,000 to $800,000 locked into one property just to make it be positive cash flow to the tune of not a lot, maybe $1,000 a month, maybe if you're lucky. That's how much you're walking away with after you've paid the mortgage, insurance, taxes, all that kind of stuff. I would much rather take all that money out of that California property, buy we did the math. We did an entire show about a year and a half ago on this, where what you could do with the money that you have wrapped up in a California home. And we looked at markets that were just constant performers in terms of rent. Phoenix, Atlanta, Denver, all these various areas. And some areas where you could get a really good price, like Charlotte, North Carolina is one, where the average price for a property, I think, was... See, I've found stuff in Phoenix that's like $180. But let's take Phoenix as an example, with $200,000 as sort of the number that we would use for properties we would buy. Well, that probably means you only need to put down $20,000 per... 40 grand. Let's go with 50 grand. You got to put down 50 grand. Plus, you're going to have 5 to 10 grand in upgrades or whatever systems you're going to want to upgrade, because they're going to go bad anyway, and it's better to have them replaced than have them go bad in that first few months that a tenant is in there. So you do that and do the math. I mean, if we're talking $500,000, well, that's an awful lot. That's 10 properties, right? So by doing that, you've accomplished two great things. You've got yourself a positive cash flow property, plus you've gotten yourself a diversified portfolio of properties. So if one property is suddenly not renting, your income per month does not drop to zero, right? It gives you some buffer. It gives you some elbow room to find that next tenant. Okay. So I know we took a weird tack on the whole slowed investor activity thing, but I kind of spelled out the types of investors, because you always see that surge of folks who jump out of the market. We actually saw that surge in a lot of areas over a year ago, where the momentum investor, right, the guy who simply relies on the growth in the market to feed their investment, those guys kind of stepped away, right? And you saw that in stats. Interestingly enough, a lot of the folks that were doing that were offshore investors, not really doing anything to the property, just buying them and holding on to them. And that's when you'll see those headlines, right? That China's divested from real estate. There was one recently where suddenly China's back in. But those are the kinds of things. And by understanding the mindset of who those folks are and how this isn't usually just everybody who's an investor backs out or goes in, it's usually staged based on who the investor is, what kind of an investor they are. It helps you get a better handle, I think, on the local marketplace. All right, folks. As always, I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say on these subjects. The goal is always to share more with you in terms of value than the time you invest. Hope we've achieved that today. I know we did a slightly longer than usual show today, but I hope it's been good data for you. For those of you with lots of experience, maybe it's just a good review, reminded you of a few things you kind of already knew. For you brand new folks, great opportunities here for you to enhance your knowledge in your marketplaces that could help you be confident enough to make that first step into real estate investment. So I hope that's how it works out for you. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you all next time.